Hello my loves and welcome back to my channel. Today I'm going to react to a video that is called This Trail is a Death Trap by MrBallen, and you know it's a 40-minute video. So buckle up, actually get something to snack, some drinks. I have my coffee right here. Let's get into it.
24-year-old Gina Allen and her brand new boyfriend, 28-year-old Brandon Day, could not believe their luck. For the past 48 hours, they had been stranded in the rugged wilderness of the San Jacinto mountain range in California when they looked down into this ravine and they saw a campsite. There was a tarp that had been strung up between two trees. And so they ran over to it hoping that the owner of this campsite would be in there and they could help them get out of these mountains. But when they got to the campsite, there wasn't anyone there. But from the looks of it, it looked like someone had been living in this site fairly recently. Underneath this makeshift roof from this tarp was a sleeping pad, there was a warm sweater, there was shoes, there was a disposable razor, some kitchen utensils, and there was a yellow backpack. Without any hesitation, Brandon and Gina, who were totally famished and they're exhausted and they're desperate, they just start rifling through the different things in camp, hoping to find some things that will help save their life, like a cell phone or a radio, or even just a lighter or some matches or some food. And so Brandon focused on all the items that are just kind of laying out under the tarp, and Gina focused on the contents of the yellow backpack. And so Gina, she opens up this backpack and she starts pulling out all these maps that are inside. And she notices on the margins of these maps, in the white space, there is handwriting, and it's done in pen, and it looks like it's been written fairly recently. Now, at first, she didn't read any of the notes that were on these margins. She was just kind of pulling them out and stacking them on the ground next to her and continuing to rummage through this bag. But at some point, out of the corner of her eye, she noticed on the top map that was sitting on the ground next to her, there was a particular note at the top of the page that as soon as she saw it, she stopped what she was doing, she turned and looked at it. She couldn't believe what she was seeing. And in fact, she didn't want to get her hopes up, but she slowly reached over, she picked the map up and she put it right in front of her face. And as soon as she was reading it, she just started laughing. She was so happy. She was so relieved. She yelled to Brandon to come over and look at this. And so Brandon stopped what he was doing. He turned around and he bent down and he looked exactly where she was looking. And when he read what she had read, he started laughing too. They were saved. There at the top of this map, there was a note that was dated the same date as the day they were there, May 8th. And so they knew whoever had written this had written it at least in the last couple of hours because it was May 8th. And so they had to be around here somewhere. And so Gina and Brandon, they stand up and they start yelling out for the owner of this camp to please come out and help them. But in their excitement, Brandon and Gina had overlooked a critical detail in this note. It would turn out that critical detail would change their lives and the life of the man who owned this camp forever.
Call the police.
Before Brandon and Gina ever began their doomed hike into the San Jacinto mountain range, another man, one which neither of them knew, was gearing up for a hike of his own that would take him through the San Jacinto mountain range. His name was John Donovan, and on April 19th, 2005, which was the day he would begin this journey, he was 59 years old. John had absolutely no family. He was born an only child, and by the time he was 10 years old, he had been orphaned and basically had to raise himself from that point onward. By the time John was in his 20s, he had moved to Virginia, where he had taken a job as a social worker. And despite making a fairly decent salary, he refused to spend any more money than he absolutely had to. It was a habit he had developed as an orphan child, trying to make ends meet with virtually no money whatsoever. And as an adult, that habit just never left him. So as a result, for his entire life, all the way up until he left for that hike in 2005, he never had anything nice. He basically wore the exact same outfit virtually every single day. He never owned a car, he never owned a phone, he never owned a computer.
I would at least buy a map or a compass that you can actually use to just, you know, understand where you're going.
Computer, and when it came to where he chose to live, he would always live in the most absurdly cheap dwellings possible, which included at one point living in a partially burned down, abandoned savings bank with no heat. John was a proud Irish Catholic. He drank lots of whiskey, he swore like a sailor, and he had no problem speaking his mind, no matter who he was talking to. While he was a lovely person once you got to meet him, his unorthodox lifestyle style and his at times gruff exterior made it pretty difficult for him to make friends for most of his life. But when he was in his 40s, he wanted to lose some weight, and so he decided to join a hiking club. And to his surprise, the other members of this hiking club adored him. They thought he was hysterical, and he made being out on the trail so much more fun and enjoyable. And before long, all these members of this club became John's family that he never had. And so John would go on every single trip this hiking club went on, no matter what. That was the most important thing to him in his life. When it came to hiking, though, John was a bit of an anomaly. Even though he would hike sometimes over 4,000 miles in any given year, he would still routinely get lost on trails he had been on dozens and dozens of times. No. But despite being totally self-aware of this fatal flaw in his hiking abilities, John rarely did anything to compensate for it. For example, he didn't bring with him on most hikes a compass, which would be the first thing you would think to bring with you to stay oriented. Also, because he refused to buy a phone, he didn't have that to aid him either if he ever got lost. In fact, John rarely brought much of anything on any hike he went on, because John is what you would call a ultralight backpacker, which basically meant you would only pack the absolute bare essentials, and in John's case, sometimes less than the absolute bare essentials.
I'm confused.
And despite his friends trying repeatedly to get him to pack more equipment so he was more prepared, he would always say no, he knows what he's doing and everything is good. And the truth is, John always did manage to get from point A to point B on all of his hikes, some of which included extremely difficult hikes, like the time he hiked the 500-mile-long Colorado Trail, or the time he hiked the 2,175-mile-long Appalachian Trail. Now, John would tell you that was all skill, but his friends would say John was extremely lucky. He would get lost, and then at the last second he would find the trail again, or he would lose some piece of critical equipment, and then just someone on the trail would happen to walk by that had an extra set of whatever it was that John needed. And then one time when John was in Poland on a hike, he slipped on this icy embankment where earlier that day, 2 other hikers had slipped and fallen to their deaths. And John has now slipped on this same embankment. He's careening down the sides, and he's flailing, he can't stop himself, and then the drawstring on his pants gets caught up in a tree, and that arrests his fall and it saves his life. And so from that point on, John would only wear those pants when he went hiking, and he called them his lucky pants. In the spring, of 2005, John and one of his very close hiking friends named Ken Baker, who was roughly his age, decided they were going to hike the 2,650-mile-long Pacific Crest Trail. This trail spanned the entire west coast of the United States. It starts in Southern California, right on the border of Mexico, and it goes all the way up to the very northern end of Washington State, right on the border of Canada.
Shout out to everybody. I had fun.
I gotta be good.
It takes the average hiker, if they're going to do this entire trail in one go, about 5 months, unless there's bad weather conditions that impede them along the way. John, 5 months.
What's the name?
Had been excitedly planning this epically long hike for the better part of the last year. He actually typed out 6 pages on his typewriter of this itinerary that planned out every single detail of this hike, down to how many ounces of coffee he would need at every stop along the way. John was especially excited about this particular hike because it was going to be the very first hike he would be doing after his retirement from being a social worker. And apparently John had huge plans for his retirement. He wanted to travel all over the United States. He wanted to go to Australia, to China, to Russia. He basically wanted to hike at least 6 months a year, every single year, until he was too old or too weak to continue to do so. But just a couple of days before John and Ken were supposed to fly out to California to begin the Pacific Crest Trail, Ken told John that he thought they should actually postpone the start of this trip by about 3 weeks. He said Southern California had experienced their snowiest winter in decades, and so it would make sense to wait a little bit of extra time to make sure all the snow had melted and that they didn't get caught in any sort of late snowstorm. Now, John was totally not having this. He had spent so much time thinking
John.
about this trip. He was so excited about it that he just couldn't wait any longer. And so he told Ken, I'm sorry, I'm going on the current timeline, whether I go alone or not. And so on April 19th, 2005, John made his way to his office where he was a social worker.
You know, I love when we are so dedicated to something, but there's like, I don't know, you need to consider things in general. I mean, come on. The only thing that's, you know, keeping the John and the Luck, you know, united, it's that string on his pants. It's a small string, okay? Anything can break it. And he knows it's a badass winter out there, and he still said, fuck it, I'm leaving. Nobody can stop me. I already know how much coffee I'm gonna have in any single stop. Who's gonna stop me?
His co-workers threw him a very small retirement party, and he literally left the office, went straight to the airport, and he flew to Southern California.
IDGAF. I don't give a fuck. Period.
All alone. When he got there, he took a chance and reached out to one of his other hiking friends, a 48-year-old tool salesman named Lynn Padgett, and asked him, you know, hey, I know you live in the area. Would you be interested in coming on at least part of the Pacific Crest Trail with me? I'm going to start here in the next couple of days. And John was extremely excited when Lynn said, you know what? Sure, I'd love to come along with you. And the two of them made their way over to Campo, California, which is right on the border of Mexico, and they began their hike along the Pacific Crest Trail. But after going only about 100 miles, Lynn's feet started swelling so badly that he could not go any farther. And so from that point onward, John would be alone. The San Jacinto mountain range is the first major mountain range that the northbound Pacific Crest Trail hikers will encounter. And statistically, it's actually the most dangerous portion of the Pacific Crest Trail, as 15% of all the fatalities that occur along this huge trail occur in the San Jacinto mountain range. It's a very steep mountain with a rapid rise in elevation from the desert floor all the way up to over 10,000 feet, which means in the summer, even when it's extremely hot down around the base of this mountain,
can be snowing.
it will probably be windy and snowing at the top. John reached the base of the San Jacinto mountain range on May 2nd, and as he began his slow climb up, all of the hikers he was encountering were all talking about the same thing. There was apparently some big snowstorm that was due to hit the San Jacinto mountain range in the next couple of days, and so all of these hikers were actually evacuating the mountain to go to this little town to wait out the storm. Everyone's fear was they would get caught on Fuller Ridge when the storm hit. Fuller Ridge is towards the top of the San Jacinto mountain range, and it's probably the most dangerous part of the entire mountain range. It's basically this totally exposed, very steep section where if you lose your footing, there's nothing to stop you from tumbling down to death. But when John heard this, he wasn't fazed at all. He was not about to evacuate because of some storm. He was just going to continue up this mountain, go over Fuller's Ridge, and carry on along the Pacific Crest Trail. And so for the rest of the day, he just continued up the mountain and eventually made camp about halfway up. He actually stopped near two other hikers that were also going to push through despite this storm. It was a 46-year-old nurse from Canada named Connie Davis and her son, 20-year-old Alex. And they were both very experienced high-altitude climbers, and they had all the right gear, and they were very well prepared. And so that night, after both parties had set up their camp, they struck up a friendly conversation, during which John made some dismissive comments about Connie's parenting style that really agitated her, although it didn't seem like John really noticed he had upset her. And so needless to say, the next morning, Connie and her son had packed up and were long gone by the time John was waking up. So John just got up, he looked at the sky, it was still clear, although he did see some gray clouds rolling in, so he could sense that yes, a storm really is on the way, but he decided he was still just going to continue on towards Fuller Ridge. So he put his backpack on and he began walking up the trail, and a little while later, when he was nearing Fuller Ridge, but was still several miles away, three very well-equipped hikers that he had not seen before came charging down the path towards him. And John stopped them and he said, hey, how is it up there? What's the weather like? What's Fuller Ridge like? And they kind of looked at John and sized him up, looking up and down, and they saw that, he's got light clothes on, he's got sneakers on, he doesn't have trekking poles, he just looks totally ill-prepared for what he's walking into. And they said to him, I don't think it's a good idea for you to continue on here. This storm is going to hit any time now, and we're not going to Fuller Ridge. We're actually turning around and leaving because of this storm and we have all the right gear. I mean, you should really consider turning around and leaving. But these three hikers would say there was just no way they were going to change John's mind. He was
all right, now this is just full-blown, I don't care about my life. He has encountered so many people that said, yo, this badass storm is coming in. It's big, you know, it's gonna come and swoop everything around the Fuller Ridge. You know, it's like a bad portion because, you know, it's very steep and you don't have a lot of trees and everything in there so you can grab yourself. You know, it's a very, you know, it's a very dangerous zone. And I think that you need to understand the difference between being excited about doing something and being negligent with your own safety.
Totally dead set on carrying on to Fuller Ridge. And so the three men that had told him not to go eventually just said, okay, you know, good luck. And they carried on down the trail and John continued up. But despite John's earlier confidence in his plan to go to Fuller Ridge and continue through San Jacinto Mountains, when the snow actually started to fall sometime in the mid-afternoon, John started to have doubts about his plans. There was already a lot of snow on the ground where he was from previous snowstorms, and that was making it hard to see the trail as it was. And now with all this additional snow starting to dump down, he was worried it was going to totally cover up the trail and he would lose it. And since he knew he kind of had a penchant for getting lost on trails, this was a real concern. But he was still very stubborn, and so despite these second thoughts, he just continued on along. And so after a while, he got to within maybe 1 or 2 miles of Fuller Ridge when he spotted up ahead of him 2 other hikers that seemed to be going in that direction. And so he ran up to them and he yelled for them to stop. And at this point, the snow is really starting to come down and the trail is completely wiped out and he can barely see in front of him. And these 2 hikers, they stop. And so he runs up to them, and when he gets up close, he can see it's actually Connie Davis and her son Alex from the night before. And so Connie is obviously not thrilled to see John again, but when he explained that he was having a really hard time staying on the trail and, you know, could he just tag along with them, Connie said, you know what, that's just fine, we're happy to have you. But she explained to him she was not going up to Fuller Ridge. Instead, she was taking a more circuitous route that would bypass the ridge. It would take a lot longer, but it would be safer given the weather conditions. John assured her that that was totally fine. He would just trail along with them, and then at some point he would break off on his own and he would go up to Fuller Ridge and they could go their separate way. And so Connie, her son, and John begin walking along together. Now, Connie and Alex, they had crampons on their shoes, which are basically like metal cleats that allow you to very easily grip the snow and ice. They had trekking poles, they had all the right warm gear, and so they're easily moving along through these weather conditions. Meanwhile, John didn't have trekking poles or any high-speed equipment. He did have crampons that he tried to put onto his shoes, but because he had sneakers that were not lined up to this type of crampon, they didn't really fit right, and so it caused him to constantly stumble and fall on the ground. And so that's how it went for a while until Connie and Alex reached this critical point. It was at this creek where they needed to go down and around, which would take them away from Fuller Ridge. And if John was going to continue, like he said he would, up to Fuller Ridge, that would be the point where he would break off from them and go up the mountain towards this ridge. And so Connie and Alex wait at the stream. They're turned around and they're looking back down the trail at John, who's fallen way behind at this point. And as they're looking at him, they're thinking, this is going to take a long time for him to finally catch up to us. And so Connie, who really wasn't all that keen in hanging around John that much longer anyways, she figured, you know what, John has made his intentions completely clear. He said he is going up to Fuller Ridge. He is an adult. He is healthy. He can do whatever he wants. And so she yelled and waved to John and signaled that she and her son were going to go down this creek and this way to Fuller Ridge, so best of luck to you. And then Connie and Alex disappeared around the corner. Once John's hiking partners had gone, John got up to that creek and he was going to try to go up to Fuller Ridge, but by that point the snow was practically blinding. And so at this point John decided, you know what, I do need to turn around and go back down the mountain and evacuate to that town where everybody else had gone to avoid the storm. And so John turns around and starts trying to backtrack along this trail back down the mountain, but the trail is gone. The snow has completely whited it out, and there's no other hikers anywhere nearby, and even if there were, he wouldn't be able to see them. And so for several hours, while it was still light out, John did his best to navigate down the mountain, and then when the sun went down, he really had no idea where he was. And so instead of trying to stay on this trail that at this point he really didn't think he was on, he looked out away from the mountain, and way down below, he saw this big bright cluster of lights. Even through the falling snow, he could clearly see those were lights of a city. And so he decided he would use that as kind of like his North Star, and he would just continuously walk downhill towards those lights. And so for several hours, he just began walking towards these lights, narrowly avoiding huge drop-offs and climbing over boulders and avoiding trees and animals. And finally, he got to this very critical point in his journey down to these lights. He reached this area called Long Valley, where he had a decision to make. He could either continue down the mountain, which would require jumping down into this ravine that once he did, he would not be able to climb back out again. It was too steep. Or he could turn around and hike way back up the mountain and go some other direction. But at this point, he had...
So basically, this man has to do the impossible either way. What I really want to understand is that I remember that he said that he reached one point where he was, you know, way back. You know, he wasn't really that close to Full Ridge. And he said that he's seen storm and that, you know, it was already, you know, snowing and he couldn't really see that good, you know, like far away because, you know, the storm was just there and it was, you know, snowing like hell. He should have just turned around and went back. I mean, the man didn't have glasses. The hiker said that he wasn't even wearing, you know, necessary clothes, you know, because, you know, it's like actually it's cold. And, you know, hearing this, that he has to do either one thing or the other thing. It's already late at night. I bet that he's exhausted. He wants to eat, he wants to sleep, he wants to drink. There's no way he can go up the mountain because he cannot see the trail. There's no way he can know where he's going. And we're talking about a big ass mountain, and we are humans, and there's just as much as we can do. And, you know, it would take him even a longer time. The storm could get worse. So basically, he had no option. So I don't know what can he do actually?
He had really no idea what direction was the best direction. All he knew is he needed to go down the mountain because his situation was getting worse and worse by the second. If he didn't find shelter soon, he might get hypothermia and just die out here. And so he decided he would jump down into this ravine. And so he laid on his stomach, he lowered himself down over the edge, and he dropped down into the valley below. Once he stood up, he just continued walking down the mountain, and at some point he spotted a stream that he began to follow along. And as he followed this ravine, which was taking him straight down the mountain, he noticed the ravine walls, these huge walls on either side of him, seemed to get closer and closer to him, like this ravine was kind of coming to a point. And then after a while, he noticed up ahead, the stream just kind of disappeared. And so he walked a little bit farther, and then he came to an abrupt stop. The water had disappeared because it had flown off a 100-foot cliff that he was now standing in front of. He had come to the edge of this huge waterfall, and there was absolutely no way to lower himself down over it. It was an absolute fall to the death if he attempted to go down this waterfall. And so he looked to his left and he looked to his right, and these huge canyon walls that had followed him all the way to this edge from when he dropped down, they were sheer cliffs. There was no way to climb those. And his initial drop into this ravine was unclimbable. He knew that going in. And so he was boxed in, he was trapped, and he likely knew that it would be at least a week or more before anybody figured out that he was even missing. And so totally disheartened, John left the edge of this cliff, this waterfall, and walked back up to a relatively flat area farther up the ravine, and he began to set up camp. He pulled out his green tarp, he put some line between two trees, he made a makeshift roof, he laid out his bed mat underneath, and then he climbed underneath the tarp and he settled in for a long night.
So I stopped here because this is a lengthy video, and I don't know if y'all like to sit through such longer videos. So comment down below if you actually love, you know, 30 or 40 minute long videos, and I'll, you know, next time I will actually, you know, keep it as long as it is. So thank you so much for watching. Give it a big thumbs up, comment down below, and subscribe so you can be a part of this pretty ass family. So make sure that you will tune in for the next video. And I want to say goodbye and have a great week, y'all.